Ciao, I'm Lachlan. I'm calling from Oxford.
Ciao, I'm Caroline, calling from Strasbourg.
And today we're just going to talk a bit about Purgatory 9. So one of the things that we thought was quite interesting rereading this canto is the idea of borders and liminality that you really get from it. So that it's a canto that sort of comes at a sort of hinge point in the comedy between, on the one hand, hell before and also all of anti-purgatory, and then on the other hand, what's ahead of it, which is sort of the start of purgation proper, which is, leading us into sort of paradise at the other end of the comedy. And this really sort of resonated with some of the things that I guess we're all going through at the moment with the coronavirus pandemic. So we all sort of feel like or at least I do, feel like I'm in this really sort of liminal holding pattern between, my life as it used to be and hopefully some idea of normalcy that we'll return to afterwards. So before we get stuck into talking about the canto, Caroline, do you want to just sort of remind us where we are in the poem?
Yeah, so the pilgrim has just, by the time we get to Purgatory 9, the pilgrim has gone through anti-purgatory. So obviously at the end of Inferno, he emerged onto the shores of Purgatory, where he ended up on this beach and he met Cato. He then goes through sort of this very nebulous space, I suppose, in anti-purgatory, where he meets some excommunicates and souls who have repented at the last minute. We also have the Valley of the Princes, which is the area, if you like, just before the door or the gate of purgatory. So it's probably useful to say that anti-purgatory is a particularly problematic area within Purgatorio, which was already a reasonably new concept in Dante's time. So it was very unorthodox. It's completely Dante's creation. And one thing I find particularly interesting is the fact that when we get to anti-purgatory, the souls are among the saved, even though they have this sort of penance or punishment, if you like. It's not really clear where they have to wait before they can begin their penance proper, in purgatory proper. But if the souls arrive sort of the day before the day of judgment, they will still go to Paradiso and be counted among the saved. So they are at once part of this community of the saved. There's a very clear distinction between hell and purgatory, but at the same time, there is this sort of subcategory where they are nonetheless not doing the work that the other souls are doing on purgatory proper. We then move on to Purgatory 9, specifically. So I mentioned the Valley of the Princes. The sun was setting in the Valley of the Princes, and Dante was he begins to feel tired because it's been a very long journey. He's made it through hell without sleeping, and so he falls asleep, and he has a dream where he is captured by an eagle and lifted up into the sky. It turns out that in reality, this was actually St. Lucia, who was transporting him closer to the door to Purgatory proper. And so he wakes up, sees Virgil. They move on to this guardian angel, who then lets them through the door into Purgatory proper. So to start things off, I've talked a little bit about this idea of borders and transition between anti-purgatory, which is very unclear and unorthodox, and then purgatory proper, where we begin to get divisions on terraces and things become a lot more clear. And I think it's very interesting that in Purgatory 9, we do have one of the few mentions of, or few uses of Purgatorio. We have the line, tu sei ormai al Purgatorio giunto. So by this point, you've got to Purgatory, which when you read that, you might well wonder what the rest of those 8 cantos we've just had were about if we're not in Purgatory yet. Similarly, in Purgatory 7, Virgil asks for directions. He wants to know dove Purgatorio ha dritto inizio, so where Purgatory starts. So I think this distinction between Purgatory proper and anti-Purgatory is really brought out in this canto and really emphasised by this idea of transition and borders. On the one hand, we have a very clear border as we enter onto the terraces, but on the other hand, we are asked to look back and think about what all of that space was that we had before. And indeed, if we think about where purgatory, anti-purgatory begins, then you might well think to the banks of the Tiber, where the souls are asked, they have to wait there before they are transported to the shores of Purgatory by the angelic boat. So at the other end, we have this very strange and unclear border. I don't know if you have any thoughts about this element.
Well, I'm just thinking about what a first-time reader would make of this, especially one, as you say, in the early 14th century, where the idea of purgatory is very new and very novel, especially purgatory as a sort of physical place that has an exact location on the globe. And then just thinking about how much happens in the Cantica that isn't really accounted for in those sort of, if you open your copy of Purgatory, you probably have a nice little map which tells you that there are 7 terraces and, these are the cantos that these terraces belong to. And actually, a lot of the most sort of interesting things that are happening in Purgatory don't really fit into those categories. So you've got, this bizarre sort of world of anti-Purgatory, but also the earthly paradise at the other end. And then even, little bits in the middle. So like quite often things are going on sort of the staircases between terraces that are, quite major moments in the Cantica that don't really belong to any part. And thinking about someone like Sordello, like where does he belong in the sort of groups of people in anti-purgatory? Does he belong to the Valley of the Princes, or is he sort of, the bit before, it's the Violent Deaths, isn't it? Or is it the Violent Deaths? Who is it?
So late people have repented late, but especially the Violent Deaths.
Okay, should we talk a bit about this image of the eagle, this sort of eagle dream that we get that takes us, I'll just open my thing a bit because the sun is setting. Speaking of the sun setting, so the sun setting in the Valley of the Princes, and Dante falls asleep and he has this dream of an eagle that sort of comes and carries him up into the sky. So he compares himself to Ganymede, who Jove carries up into the heavens to be his cupbearer. And there are all sorts of sort of interpretations that people can and people have sort of applied to this episode. But I think from the perspective of talking about borders, one of the most interesting things is what then happens afterwards. So he wakes up and he's sort of by the gate, and then Virgil tells him that actually it wasn't an eagle at all. It was Saint Lucy, as you said, who comes and sort of carries him up to the gate. So there's this kind of border between, on the one hand, the sort of the dream world, this kind of liminal space, and then there's sort of back to the actual narrative that we've got going on.
And I think it's interesting to think about the sort of geographical or physical gap that creates, because we know that Virgil follows Lucia for about 2 hours. But if you think of that in terms of space, which is covered on that journey, we already have this very unclear sort of distinction, if there are any sort of distinctions in anti-purgatory. And then we also have this sort of 2-hour gap where they're traveling and we don't know what has been covered. So the landscape becomes even more nebulous, I think, when you look back at anti-purgatory there. And of course, it's not the only dream either in Purgatorio. So it does set up a structure across the rest of the Cantica. Yeah,
so we've got this one obviously in Purgatory 9, then we've also got at the start of Purgatory 19, we've got the dream of the Siren, which is just before Dante gets onto the Terrace of Avarice. And then finally this dream in 27 of Leah and Raquel. So actually they all happen at these very sort of transitional moments, don't they? So you've got in Purgatory 9, just before we get to Purgatory proper, and then you've got in 19, just before we get to these sort of upper terraces after Sloth, so the Troppo di Vigore, as Virgil says. And then just before we get to the Earthly Paradise in 28.
Yeah, another thing that I think is interesting about especially in Purgatory 9, perhaps because it's the first dream, the introduction of dreams and dreaming and sleep within Purgatorio is especially interesting when you look back to Inferno, where none of that was possible. Firstly, because there wasn't the sun, so there was no real distinction between night and day. And secondly, because the journey is sort of it's not broken up at all by periods of the pilgrim sleeping. So here sleep seems to regain a value through the inclusion of dreams. If you look back to Inferno, all you have is him fainting at the end of 3. That's the only sort of moment of transition between unconsciousness and consciousness. And again at the end of 5. And we could perhaps talk about him waking up in Inferno 1 right at the beginning of the poem. So I think that's an interesting contrast to think about as well.
Should we talk a bit about this address to the reader that you get about halfway through the canto? So I think it is actually the ninth address to the reader in Canto 9. But it sort of marks an interesting point in the canto as well. So it sort of introduces the second half of the canto where you get. So I'll read you the address first. It's Lettor tu vedi ben com'io innalzo la mia matera. So reader, you see how I'm raising up my material. So I think this really ties into the second half of the canto where you get a real kind of density of images to be glossed, or sort of potential allegory. So you've got these three steps that the gatekeeper angel is sort of standing on. So one I think is white marble, one is sort of a purple color with a sort of cracked cross in it, and the last one is the color of, it says blood from a spurting vein, I think. And then you've got the two keys, don't you? So you've got the gold one and the silver one, and even the color of the gatekeeper's cloak is the sort of gray color. Some people have glossed that as maybe it's a sort of connection to Franciscanism, who knows. But I think there's really something in this address to the reader that sort of invites an allegorical reading in some of these kind of dense images that you get in the second half of the canto. So again, we've got this kind of double valence going on of sort of what's on the surface and then maybe what's beneath that sort of allegorical veil.
And that's something that happens in the previous canto as well. We have a similar address to the reader. So they're very close together. In this case, we have the aguzza qui lettor ben gli occhi al vero. So sharpen your eyes, reader, to the truth which the poet is about to unfurl. And that's just before we have the Rappresentazione Sacra, which is again a very allegorical episode with Purgatorio 8. So it is interesting that we have these two moments so close together, I think.
Should we talk a bit about the start of the canto? So the thing is, we're talking about borders, this sort of opening image of the sun. Well, I guess the sun rising in Italy and then setting in Purgatory. So some people have, it's a very, very contested crux, I guess. Some people like to see these opening lines as describing a lunar aurora. But I think it sort of makes a lot more sense if you think about it as articulating this difference in time zones that you also get at other places in Purgatory. So thinking about maybe Canto 2, Canto 4, telling the time by sort of what's going on in Jerusalem, but also on the Ganges. And what's the third one? In Spain, I think, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So what we've got the concubina di Titone. So Titone is concubine, is the figure of dawn who sort of leaves the bed every day and sort of brings about the start of the day. Is then contrasted to, I guess, the sun setting and readying Dante for his first dream of Purgatory. And I think one of the most interesting things about this image is that it really articulates this kind of border between, the world of Purgatory and the world of Italy, where sort of Dante's readers are. Do you want to talk a bit about that, maybe?
Yeah, I find it also makes this very clear border, as you say, between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, which is repeated throughout Purgatory. And I think it does engage the reader in trying to think across these borders, if you like, thinking across the equator, and really visualize and imagine where the sun is and what effect that would have on where the pilgrim is in Purgatorio. And that, I think, is particularly interesting when you start to think about sort of the context of preaching in Dante's day, and the fact that the congregation would often be encouraged to think about souls in the afterlife, so purgatory, hell, paradise, in relation to their own lives. So that's almost sort of an exercise in doing just that, through imagining the position of the sun. Yeah,
I guess that really sort of ties into this idea of Purgatory as a sort of ethical treatise almost that I think George Corbett's written about recently. This idea that it's not just a sort of narrative; it's a real sort of model for how to kind of think about your vices. But I also think the other way around, there's this sort of nostalgia that the souls in Purgatory have for their bodies, which are buried up there where the sun is rising. So I think that there's sort of interesting distinctions going on in this kind of lots of sort of different levels of borders, not just kind of geographical, but also ethical, also narrative, that really converge in this canto. I guess the other obvious border to talk about for the canto is the end. So you get this image of, when Dante's approaching the gate and he hears it opening. He says that he hears a Te Deum Laudamus, and says that he sort of, hears, what does he say? He says, Quando cantar con organi si stea, corsi or no s'intendono le parole. So when you hear singing, well, I guess, so con organi has been, discussed in different ways. Either it's with an organ, or it could be also sort of in organum, so different voices singing together at the same time. Sometimes you hear the words, sometimes you don't. So I think, again, this is a very appropriate image to end a canto that's sort of really about these kind of liminal spaces in the commedia, this idea of sort of, on the one hand, understanding, on the other hand, not understanding, and obviously appropriate to come right at the end of the canto.
And equally at the end of this canto, we have the passage through the door, which is divided across between the end of canto 9 and the beginning of 10. So he opens the door at the end of 9, and we hear it swinging closed behind us at the end of 10. So there's a very dramatic division across these two cantos, which I think really reinforces some of the themes we've been talking about, the borders and the transitions.
Yeah. Okay, that will probably do.
Yes, no. Yeah, it's been lovely to talk about Purgatory 9, and we hope that maybe you'll want to go away and read it or read it again. So yes.
Yeah. Okay, ciao.
Ciao. Alla prossima.